In the dead of winter, under Nazi occupation, homes went cold. By force, by scarcity, or by sabotage. When the power lines were cut and coal was rationed to the military, civilians across Europe faced a brutal truth. Firewood was currency, and warmth became a matter of ingenuity, not luxury. Modern households rely on thermostats, insulated walls, and the quiet hum of central heating. But during the Second World War, none of that could be counted on. In places like Leningrad, Warsaw, and the Belgian countryside, entire families slept in rooms barely warmer than the outside air. And yet, they survived. Not through brute force or gadgetry, but through forgotten, low-tech tricks rooted in physics, tradition, and quiet desperation. We think survival in winter means building fires or burning fuel. But real endurance came from trapping heat, redirecting warmth, and using every scrap of material like it mattered. Because it did. It wasn't about heating the house. It was about heating a corner, a bed, and breathing. You'll discover the forgotten World War II heating methods that worked without electricity, oil, or gas, and why they may be our last line of defense when the grid goes dark. Hit like and subscribe to rediscover the skills our ancestors never wanted us to forget. Number 1. Lime stacks embedded in walls. In the frostbitten towns of eastern Austria and the Bohemian Highlands, warmth didn't come from stoves, it came from the walls themselves. When coal was seized by the state and the lights went out for good, villagers turned to something older than electricity. Lime. Not for mortar, but for heat. They would heat chunks of quicklime over fire, sometimes during the day when fuel was allowed for cooking. The lime, once fired, was embedded into hollowed stone or clay-lined cavities within their home's interior walls. Then the fire was extinguished. What followed was quiet but powerful. As the lime cooled, it radiated heat slowly into the room, hour after hour. The principle was simple. Quicklime retains thermal energy far longer than wood or coal. Where a fire dies out in minutes, lime breathes warmth like a sleeping animal. No flicker, no smoke, just stone glowing coldly in the dark. We rely on constant power to keep rooms warm. But in wartime, people learned to front-load their heat, store it when fuel was briefly available, then shut down and survive the long night on what they'd captured. These lime stacks weren't makeshift, they were engineered, passed down by masons who knew how to seal heat inside walls, brick by brick. The lime had to be handled carefully with too much moisture and it could crack or even flare. But done right, it gave families one more edge against the cold. A passive heater that didn't burn fuel, didn't need tending, and couldn't be confiscated. In old alpine villages, mothers would press their children's bedding against lime-warmed walls. Sometimes, you could see where the frost stopped an outline of life, clinging to the stone that had saved it. This wasn't central heating. It was thermal memory, embedded in architecture. It wasn't survival. It was quiet defiance, sealed in the walls themselves. Tech fails, but this method never did. Number 3. Ceramic water bottles as night radiators. Cold was the first thing you noticed. Not hunger, not even the silence. Just the way the air bit through wool and bone the moment night fell. In the war-struck countryside of France, where power lines had fallen and coal was stockpiled for the army, mothers didn't wait for miracles. They filled thick ceramic jugs with boiling water, sometimes from the same pot used to wash clothes, and sealed them tight. Wrapped in old shirts or linen rags, these makeshift radiators were carried, still steaming, into every room. One went under the bed, one behind the cradle, one near the cracked window, where frost crept like fingers across the glass. They didn't glow, they didn't hum, but hour by hour, they gave off the kind of warmth that didn't just heat a room. It calmed a soul, but the kind of warmth that made a child fall asleep before their feet went numb, that kept an elder's hands from curling in the cold. People think of hot water bottles as a luxury or a quaint comfort. During the war, they were neither. They were defense against frostbite, against sickness, against despair. In some homes, only one fire could be lit each day. For cooking, there was no second chance to get warm. The water that came off that flame had to last until morning. And ceramic held heat longer than anything they had. Unlike metal, it didn't burn on contact. It breathed slowly. Even as the air dropped below freezing, that one bottle kept giving. Mothers passed them to children like treasure. A bottle in the arms meant safety. A bottle at your feet meant sleep. And when morning came, the water inside was still lukewarm. Proof that warmth could be stored, even when the world outside had none to offer. This wasn't cleverness, it was care, shaped into clay. Not a heater, not a tool, A quiet promise that someone had thought of you hours before the cold arrived. Number 4. Straw-stuffed beds and furniture. You could hear it before you saw it. The whisper of straw shifting under the weight of another sleepless night. Not mattresses, not cushions, just sacks, frames, and crates packed with dry stalks, stuffed by hand and stitched with string. In wartime villages from Ukraine to rural Slovakia, straw wasn't for animals. It was insulation, for bodies, for bones, for breath. Feathers were too rare. Wool was for soldiers, but straw was everywhere. And it held a secret. It didn't generate heat, it preserved it. By trapping the air around the human body, it slowed the loss of warmth, layer upon layer of dry stalks, locking in what little heat a person could make. Children slept on it. Mothers padded benches with it. Old men leaned against straw-packed chairs near the stove, chasing back the cold with every shallow breath. They didn't call it survival. They called it sleep. And every few days, they'd pull the old straw out and pack it fresh, drier, cleaner, better at holding warmth. It wasn't about comfort. Sharp stalks left scratches. Mice sometimes nested inside, but they used it anyway, because it worked, because it was all they had. Even shoes were stuffed with straw, not for softness, but for insulation. Layers inside worn boots gave just enough buffer between flesh and frost to finish a walk, or survive one. What's forgotten today is how resourceful that simplicity was. In a time before foam, before fiber fill, before central heat, people hacked the cold with what grew from the ground. Straw didn't just line barns, it lined hope. And if you walked into one of those homes at night, you'd hear the creak of beds, the rustle of stalks, the deep silence of bodies sleeping close together on a field they had brought inside. They weren't resting, they were recovering from the cold. And in the morning, they shook the straw out, hung it to dry, and gave thanks that one more night had passed without frostbite, without illness, without loss. Not because of machines, because of plants and persistence. This wasn't comfortable, it was defense, woven from the husks of harvest and the will to survive. Number 5. Layered clothing. Hung on walls, wool didn't go to waste. Not during war, not when each thread could hold back the winter. In the frozen winters of 1941 and 1942, especially during the siege of Leningrad, when temperatures dropped to 30 degrees and heating was gone, people learned that survival didn't come from wearing warm clothes. It came from hanging them. They took old coats, worn trousers, discarded uniforms, whatever they had, and nailed or stitched them onto the inside walls of their homes. Layers. Sometimes 3, sometimes 6. A lining of fabric between the fragile warmth inside and the killing frost outside. These weren't decorations. They were thermal barricades. Even shattered apartments and abandoned cellars in Warsaw were repurposed this way, and families who had no fire, no fuel, and no blankets hung every usable garment they could find across windows, door frames, and thin wooden walls. A single wool coat across a drafty window could mean the difference between frostbite and sleep. And it wasn't just the walls. Blankets were hung from ceilings like curtains to trap rising body heat. Doorways were closed off with layers of stitched cloth, forming heat pockets inside a room. It wasn't cozy, but it was warmer. This was war. Every sock became insulation. Every scarf, a seal. Even enemy uniforms stripped from the dead or found abandoned were sewn into walls. No fabric was judged, only used. In rural parts of the Soviet Union, mothers used old flour sacks stitched together to make full-length wall quilts. In England, blackout curtains doubled as heat traps. Thick, heavy, dark. Function over form. These makeshift methods worked because cloth doesn't just block wind. It absorbs moisture, reduces convection, and holds stagnant air. A barrier you can build with your hands. In a world where homes cracked with cold, these layers weren't just warmth, they were boundaries between danger and shelter, between the war outside and a family trying to make it to spring. Every garment on the wall told a story of sacrifice, of adaptation, of someone refusing to let the cold decide who lives. It wasn't fashion, it was a fortress stitched in silence. Number 6. Pasted paper seals. In war-torn Europe, where entire cities had their heating destroyed by bombing raids, families fought the cold with whatever they had left. In many homes, that meant flour, water, and old newspapers. They made glue from scratch, just flour and hot water, stirred into a paste over fire. Then they dipped strips of paper into that thick, sticky mix and pressed them along the seams of windows and doors, across the cracks, over the frames, along every joint where warmth could escape or the cold might sneak in. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. This method was common in besieged cities like Leningrad and bombed-out neighborhoods of London. In both cases, civilians faced not only freezing temperatures, but shattered infrastructure. Glass was broken, frames were warped. There was no way to buy replacements, and nothing left to burn. So they sealed their homes one torn page at a time. Children were often the ones tasked with it. Hands stained with glue, newspapers sliced into ribbons. In some places, even book pages were used. Novels, journals, wartime notices, anything printable was turned into a heat shield. And when they finished, the room looked strange, as if wallpaper had exploded and glued itself to every edge. But the draft stopped, and the silence changed. It got thicker, warmer, softer. Some families layered the paper seals with soot or wax for added insulation. Others glued strips of cloth or even dried leaves between the layers. The goal wasn't beauty, it was survival, and every strip added one more layer between skin and snow. In the countryside, flour paste was often replaced with mashed potato or tree sap, anything sticky that would hold paper to wood. The creativity was endless, because the alternative was frostbite, or worse. These paper seals weren't just craft projects, they were the last defense of homes that had lost everything else. The final breath of warmth held together by stories, headlines, and flour paste. Each strip carried meaning, proof that even when the world fell apart, people still tried to patch it back together with their bare hands. It wasn't a strategy, it was instinct wrapped in newspaper. Number 7. Sleeping near retained heat ovens. Occupied villages of Italy, in the frozen reaches of western Russia, and deep into the Balkans, warmth didn't come from stoves that burned all night. Fuel was too scarce. What kept people alive was a trick older than the war itself: retained heat in masonry ovens. Clay ovens, used by generations to bake bread, weren't just cooking tools. They were radiant heaters. Built thick with stone or adobe, they absorbed the fire's energy during the day and exhaled it slowly through the night. The heat didn't flicker. It didn't blaze. It lingered. After meals were cooked and wood turned to ash, families didn't scatter to bedrooms. They stayed near the oven, laid blankets across the floor, pushed straw mattresses close to the clay. Cribs were nudged against its curve. Grandparents leaned their backs on it and slept without shivering, for once. This wasn't cultural. It was survival. These ovens weren't portable, but the heat they gave off was precious. One good burn could warm a room for 12 hours or more, and the secret was mass. Thick stone held warmth the way lungs hold breath. In some homes, the oven was built into the center of the house, so every wall could share the heat. Even animals were brought inside, kept close to the kitchen on bitter nights. Not for comfort, but because they too carried heat. Life, huddled around the fading breath of fire. In war-damaged towns where entire heating systems had been blown apart, these ovens became lifelines. In northern Yugoslavia, some families rebuilt broken ovens with salvaged bricks just to restore that warmth. One good burn. That's all they hoped for. And no electricity, no gas, just clay, fire, and patience. The body adapts to cold, but the mind needs one place that feels safe. And for many during the war, that place was beside the oven. The glow had faded, but the heat remained, buried in stone, waiting in silence. Children would fall asleep, listening to the faint crackle left in the brick. Elders would sigh against the warm curve of clay. It wasn't comfortable. It was survival pressed into the earth. And by morning, when the cold returned, they knew what had kept them alive wasn't just the fire, but how they used what it left behind. Number 8. Salt sack insulation. Salt was meant for food, for meat, for wounds. But during the freezing winters of World War II, salt took on a new role: insulation. In parts of Eastern Europe where grain sacks were common and nothing went to waste, families began lining their walls and floors with coarse salt bags. The thick canvas kind once used to transport food supplies or preserve livestock feed. Not for warmth themselves, but for how they interacted with air and moisture. Salt absorbs humidity, and when packed tightly in layers of rough cloth or stored in burlap sacks, it helped pull the dampness out of freezing rooms. Moisture makes cold worse. A wet floor chills the bones. A damp wall draws heat from your skin. But rooms lined with salt sacks stayed drier, and drier meant warmer. Hungarian farmers and Polish villagers would take empty sacks from old salt shipments and press them along exterior walls, creating makeshift padding between the room and the winter. Some stitched them into thick quilts. Others packed them under beds or across floorboards. The canvas alone helped block drafts, but the salt inside added weight, density, and a layer of quiet thermal resistance. It wasn't soft, it wasn't pleasant, but it worked. This technique was especially valuable in bombed-out homes or rural shelters with no proper insulation. Sometimes bags were warmed during the day by the sun or placed near a stove, then moved closer to where people slept. They didn't radiate heat, but they kept the cold from getting in, and in makeshift bunkers and partisan hideouts, salt sacks also served another purpose. They masked human scent and absorbed body odor. An accidental survival trick, when being discovered, meant death. People began reusing these sacks again and again. When the salt inside hardened or clumped, they broke it up with sticks, aired it out, and repacked it. No one had the luxury to discard anything that worked. It wasn't just a wall covering. It was a barrier against losing heat, losing health, losing hope. What protected families in those winters wasn't technology. It was awareness of what the cold really was, not just temperature, but moisture, movement, and time. Salt slowed all three. Number 9. Clay pot and candle heaters. When every chimney had gone cold and every stove was silent, people turned to the smallest flame they had left, and taught it how to last. Across blockaded cities like Leningrad, where fuel was vanished and firewood could cost a loaf of bread, survivors built warmth from near nothing: a few candles, a clay flower pot, and time. The method was desperate, but brilliant. 1 or 2 candles, often made from tallow, wax scraps, or even animal fat, were lit beneath an inverted clay pot, propped up with stones or old cans. As the heat rose, it was trapped by the terracotta. Slowly, steadily, the pot warmed. And once it was hot enough, it began to radiate heat outward, not in bursts, but in waves. Clay holds heat like a secret. It doesn't flare, it doesn't flicker, it stores. A flower pot meant for soil became a silent radiator, warming small spaces long after the candle died. In crowded apartments, people placed them near their feet, under tables, beside makeshift beds. It didn't heat the room, it heated a moment. A breath. A corner of courage. Some crafted double-layered setups, one pot inside another, with airspace between. More mass, more storage, more warmth. In Warsaw's underground resistance hideouts, where striking a match could mean death, these candle heaters were hidden beneath crates or stacked books, impossible to detect from outside, and nearly smokeless. But the brilliance wasn't just in the physics, it was in the mindset. This wasn't about comfort, it was about direction. Capturing heat, focusing on it, letting the smallest flame do the most work possible. And in that flickering glow, families gathered, not just for warmth, but for will. Because in war, the greatest threat wasn't always hunger or gunfire. It was a hopeless cold, the kind that made you stop moving, stop thinking, Stop surviving. And a warm clay pot held that threat back by inches. They called it nothing. Didn't name it. I just used it. And night after night, it reminded them, warmth doesn't come from what you have. It comes from what you understand. They didn't survive winter by burning more. They survived by losing less. What you've just seen wasn't innovation. It was instinct sharpened by desperation. From salt sacks to clay pots, straw beds to heated walls, these weren't hacks. They were lifelines built from nothing but memory, material, and quiet defiance. In the silence of blackout nights, without a single watt of power, families endured because they understood what warmth really was. Not a thermostat setting, but a series of decisions. Where to place the body, how to trap the breath, what to seal, what to store. And today, in a world that still believes comfort comes from control, we forget the truth they died to prove. Resilience isn't a product, it's a practice. They didn't wait for help. They became the heat, and they passed those methods on, not with manuals or manuals, but with worn hands, layered cloth, and habits stitched into walls. Now we stand on the edge of forgetting them completely, but we don't have to. You've just uncovered the knowledge that held families together when everything else fell apart. These are the blueprints for surviving, not just without power, but without panic. Bring them back. Subscribe to this channel, not for content, for continuity, for memory, for the next cold night when nothing works but what you already know.